Okay, now we are recording. Welcome to the Spiritual Principles of Edgar Cayce. I am Blake Cahoon of the Angelic Path. We tried to do this on Facebook Live, but it is currently not working, so we are going to use the Zoom platform and have invited people, so they may be joining us. In the meantime, we're going to proceed with this recording, and then I will post it on the Facebook, on the Angelic Awakenings group afterwards. So, okay, let's go ahead and get going. And again, my apologies for Facebook not working. Okay, so my intention with this is to do one of these principles for the next 5 days. Now, if you enjoy this, we may go on. There may be a fee involved. But we're going to do the first 5 days for free or asking a love donation. We have a donation button on our website, theangelicpath.com, all one little thing. It's theangelicpath.com. There is a donation button. And if you like what you're hearing on that, we ask that you give a love donation. We used to call these blue skies, but the team said go ahead and use love. Now, what my intention is with this week is we're going to be using, and I apologize it's backwards, but this is the Essential Edgar Cayce. It is edited and introduced by Mark Thurston, PhD. And Mark Thurston is an educator, psychologist, an author of 18 books about practical spirituality. He teaches transpersonal psychology at Atlantic University in Virginia Beach, Virginia, and has more than 25 years experience working with the Association for Research and Enlightenment, the organization founded by Edgar Cayce. I'm going to sneeze. Which is why it's more fun when it's live. This is live, but it's going to be recorded for a lot of you. Okay, so what happened was I started reading the introduction, and it had so many great information that I thought, oh my God, I have got to give this information to my audiences, my customers, my students, and all that, because this is really great information. And so that's how the genesis of this session, these 5 sessions, came together. Now, I don't know how many of you know about Edgar Cayce, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about him in just a minute. But these 12 spiritual principles outlined in this book, this introduction, well, first of all, Edgar Cayce lived in the 1930s and 40s. That's when he was most popular. And he was called the Sleeping Prophet. And the spiritual principles back then are the same as now. Because, of course, spiritual principles are universal throughout time. But sometimes people say, where did all this stuff come from? And I'm like, well, it's always been with us. But he was one of the first in this modern times, and is often referred to, and this is why he's so popular, because he did give us so much information. And he gave us these spirituality principles. Now, the other thing I'm going to do with these sessions is not only are we going to use this book, but I want to use these books too, because a lot of the principles in this book are going to be found in this book and other modern teachings. But it started back here in the most modern times, okay? It started way, way back when. And a lot of these principles you're going to find in a lot of religious texts. Some you might actually have to find deep down in, but we're not going to bother with the religious text. We're going to work with spiritual. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Edgar Cayce. First of all, he was, and I'm going to go over the information here in this introduction. Mark Thurston knew the Cayces and works at the center that Edgar Cayce founded. So he is very well versed on who and what Edgar Cayce is all about. Edgar Cayce was one of the most remarkable and mysterious men of the 20th centuries. sometimes called the Sleeping Prophet or the Miracle Man of Virginia Beach. He was struck with taglines that more often than not reflected the sensationalistic side of his work rather than its real depth and meaning. At the core, Cayce was a Christian mystic philosopher and an intuitive healer. For the 43 years of his adult life, he taught by delivering discourses or by giving readings while in prayer-induced trance, which was transcribed by a secretary or family member because he could recall nothing once the 20 to 45-minute sessions were over. The sheer volume of Edgar Cayce's output is enormous. There are some 14-plus transcripts in existence today, both in print and since the early 1980s electronic format. 2/3 of his readings offer holistic recommendations for treating specific physical ailments and diseases due to the fact that he began his career as a medical intuitive, and throughout his life, most of those who sought him out requested readings of a medical nature. All of his biographers, in fact, present fascinating anecdotal evidence of the success of these prescriptive readings. The remaining third of Cayce's work focused on spiritual growth, dream interpretation, ancient civilizations, reincarnation, life purpose, and the many pragmatic issues of trying to integrate body, mind, spirit into daily life, including such everyday issues as parenting and even business practices. So most of this book is about the teachings and for his philosophy. But Cayce's ideas were often shaped by his personal beliefs and by the difficult times in which he lived, including the Great Depression and 2 world wars. As editor and commentator of this book, Mark Thurston says, "I should begin by noting that I never met Edgar Cayce. He died in 1945, 5 years before I was born. But for more than 30 years, I have worked professionally for 2 organizations he co-founded, and I have spent countless hours with dozens of individuals who knew him and worked with him directly, including his 2 sons, Hugh Lynn and Edgar Evans, and his secretary, Gladys Davis Turner. Thanks to their memories of him, I feel I've garnered at least my own personal understanding of what the man was like." Now, first of all, he was revered as a pioneer of the body, mind, spirit approach to healing. And he was doing the best with what he had, okay? He also comes from a very Christian background. Now, he goes into several of the types of audiences that he has and he has attracted. One audience is the parapsychology, which is a scientific study of psychic ability. The other one is so-called New Age movement. That's what they used to call us. They're seeking meaning, purpose, and direction in life in ways that have taken them outside of mainstream religion. A lot of his stuff for them was about predictions. And then there's an audience of seekers that go beyond the superficial, and they are trying to look at their lives in a whole new way, to see their own religious traditions in a new light, to recognize new pathways to be spiritually open to them, and to generally rethink what life is all about. So he also talked about the value of dreams, the importance of meditation, a perspective of reincarnation, karma, and grace, and he even talked about astrology. So I hear somebody coming in. Hello, Victoria. So this is one of the most often quoted books about Edgar Cayce. Is called, I think it's called A River Runs Through It. There is a river. Okay, there is a river. It is the #1 biography of Edgar Cayce, and he also worked with Thomas Sugrue, S-U-G-R-U-E. He wrote the book, and Edgar Cayce actually worked with him, and he wrote that in 1943. So one of the things that started Edgar Cayce, and I don't want to go into a lot of detail about this, but in order to really understand Cayce, I'm going to give you just enough highlights of Cayce to let you know that what he was all about. Now, he grew up on a farm in the southwest part of the state of Kentucky, just outside of Hopkinsville. The nearest big city was Nashville, Tennessee, which is about 200 miles to the southeast. It's right in the heart of Christian County. Now, he was profoundly influenced by his parents. His mother's name was Carrie, and she was a powerful influence. She was warm and nurturing, but she was a deeply religious woman. And also, the relationship with the men in the family seemed to be more complex. His paternal grandfather, Thomas Cayce, was a strong influence on him, better modeling the masculine aspects of strength and accomplishment, coupled with sensitivity that Edgar's own father, Leslie, did not have. So he's very close to his grandfather. Unfortunately, Thomas drowned when the horse he was riding threw him into a lake, which the 4-year-old Edgar Cayce witnessed and no doubt was traumatized by. Years later, as an adult, Edgar would write of this trying experience in his diary, which was not published until 1997 in Edgar Cayce, My Life as a Seer, edited by A. Robert Smith. After the death of his grandfather, Cayce wrote, "I often wonder just what effect these associations of thought have had on my mental being or my activities in this life." Now, Thomas Cayce was considered a clairvoyant in his own right, although he was confused about his gift and therefore cautious about it. Edgar recalls writing with Thomas and being able to hear disembodied voices speaking to him. Quote, "I also saw him move tables and other articles, apparently without any contact with these objects themselves," unquote. So when Edgar Cayce asked his grandfather about this, his grandfather said, "I don't know what the power is, but don't fool with it." No doubt that he was highly influenced by his grandfather, although he was 4 when his grandfather passed, but these abilities often come down in families. I apologize, my nose is just completely going nuts on me. Now, a lot of biographers of Edgar Cayce just moved the relationship with his father completely over. His father's name was Leslie. He was affectionately known as the Squire. He's a dashingly good-looking, sporting a prominent handlebar mustache in photographs. However, he was not particularly successful, moving from one job to another and never really settling into a career. Apparently, he also had a problem with alcohol. Now, Edgar Cayce began to demonstrate clairvoyance as a young man. It was Leslie who was eager to explore this mental power, including its commercial potential. So basically, his father trying to exploit his abilities. Edgar Cayce's early years revealed that from a very early age, he possessed uncanny powers that would surface spontaneously. At 6 or 7, he said to his parents that he saw visions, and he occasionally spoke with relatives who had recently died. His parents basically said, other than his father who later on exploited these things, basically they said, and when he was that young, they said it was an overactive imagination and paid him little attention. When he was 13 years old, he became an avid Bible reader, and when he was about 10, rather, and obviously, probably inspired by his mother. She used to go to Christian revival meetings, which are very popular in America during the Reconstruction era. He had vowed to read the Bible in its entirety every year for the rest of his life, a promise he apparently kept, an expression of true dedication and remarkable achievement in its own right. One day he had a vision, which he describes in his own vision, where he had been reading the vision of Manoah, for I love the story of Samson. I prayed very earnestly that afternoon as I sat in the woods by my favorite tree that so often seemed to speak to me. That night I was not yet asleep when the vision first began, but I felt as if I was being lifted up. A glorious light, as of the rising morning sun, seemed to fill the entire room, and a figure appeared at the foot of my bed. I was sure it was my mother, and I called to her, but she didn't answer. For the moment, I was frightened, climbed out of bed, and went to my mother's. Bless you. No, she hadn't called. Almost immediately after I returned to my couch, the figure came again. There it seemed all gloriously bright, an angel or what, I knew not, but gently, patiently it said, "Thy prayers are heard. You will have your wish. Remain faithful, be true to yourself, help the sick, the afflicted." So I'm going to leave the biography there, and I'll come back to it in our next session because there's a lot of different things here, and it goes on for several pages, but I want to get to the spiritual principles. He didn't become more famous. He really didn't have a lot of, I just will preface it by saying Edgar Cayce didn't have a lot of success in his lifetime, as so often many of us don't. However, after his death, that's when he really became known. Now, the first spiritual principle, and there are 12 of them, is that everything is connected. All is one. And I'm just going to read the short couple paragraphs that this introduction gives up to us, and then we can have a discussion. The oneness of life is the foundation on which the teachings of Edgar Cayce rest. He even said on one occasion that those interested in studying spiritual law should first study the principles of oneness for 6 months before moving on. Clearly, oneness means more than just some platitude we toss around. All is one. And then keep living our lives based on superficial distinctions rather than the deeper reality of unity. To Cayce, a mystic means to see his work in terms of oneness. For surely the essence of mysticism is a belief in the underlying unity of all things that otherwise appear to be distinct. Mysticism means going beyond differentiating such qualities as inner and outer, light and dark, good and bad, and bring us together the extremes. As Cayce often put it, only in the Christ consciousness do the extremes meet. His point here was not to rank one religion over another, but to champion a state of consciousness that lives as potential within us all. Emphasis in the book. But Cayce's mystical approach takes things a step further. Once we perceive the unity links the apparent differences in life, then it's our challenge to return to the world of distinctions and apply what we have learned as practical mystics. We can bring this sense of oneness to everything we do, which leads to the second essential principle, which we'll be discussing in our next session, but that second principle is life is purposeful. So I looked at that and I started reading that and I was like, all is one. Well, that's the spiritual law of oneness. And I happened to be reading this book at the same time. And so I was reading the core messages of the conversation with God, which is this book here, which I don't have the cover anymore, but this is the Conversations with God, which I'm starting to read. And of course, everything's backwards, but the core message of this, and this really kind of breaks it down, all these core messages that are in this book, as well as like half a dozen of his other books, Neil Donald Walsh. And so I started reading this, and I'm like, oh, well, look at this. So he goes into the law of oneness too. Okay, and just bear with me here. So the Conversations with God core message number 1 is, we are all one. All things are one thing. There is only one thing, and all things are part of the one thing there is. This means you are divine. You are not your body, you are not your mind, and you are not your soul. You are the unique combination of all three, which comprises the totality of you. You are an individual of divinity, an expression of God on earth. And Neil Donald Walsh goes into and says that these are two immediate conclusions of this statement. We are all a part of God and cannot be separate from God. And so many of our Christian religions separate us. It's sort of like, okay, you're out there and I'm here and I have to believe a certain way to be able to get to you. And most spiritual stuff, not religious stuff, but spiritual stuff will say, no, we are all part of God and cannot be separate from God. We are all also a part of each other and cannot be separate from each other. One of the things that are going on right now in North America, and specifically United States, where we're broadcasting from, is we're having a very divided country. We're having it divided by race and culture and politics. And if we can remember the fact that we are all one, we have a better understanding of why, when we look at this perceived separation or this enforced separation by people who are trying to enforce this separation, we realize that that's simply an illusion, because we will never be separate from one another. The fact is that we have a divine spark, and this is coming from the team, we have a divine spark of the God force, the universal force, the intelligent force, which we call God, in us all. And therefore, we're all connected, because that universe is like water that flows through everything. And so we are all connected in that way. Now, logical as they may be, both of these conclusions, it turns out, have become highly controversial, largely because our separation from each other and from our deity has been so long lodged in our ancient story. Neil Donald Walsh talks about where this idea of separation came from. I don't think that we need to go into that, but he does say one of the things that we have to do, and this is several things that, and it goes into this for pages and pages and pages, which I don't want to go into with you guys, because it's a whole lesson. I could spend 2 hours on this all by myself, but let's apply this message to everyday life. This is why I like this book, because it's saying, okay, when we are all does not mean that what's mine is yours and yours is mine. The concept of oneness does not eliminate the possibility of personal possessions or individual expressions, okay? Let's see. He wrote a whole book on core message 1. So this is what I'm saying. This is the number one thing we need to talk about. And it's the calm before the storm. Basically, he's saying to you, if you can look at yourself and others and realize, and he doesn't really go into a lot of the everyday how applying. I just kind of read it and it was like, there's nothing there. But the team is saying to me to tell you that if you can recognize, again, if you can recognize the fact that we have this divine spark, this divine force, this is the energy, we're all made of God stuff. And if we can look at that and recognize that you have God stuff in every living being, and that includes plants, including animals, we are one. We are one. You can't separate. You can't separate people from their God when God is us. That's where that whole God thing, God is us controversy came from. People started talking about, oh, well, you're God. You're talking about your God. No, you can't say that. This is the principle behind that saying, and what it really means. We're all one. We're all connected. And if this is a principle that Cayce laid out as number one in a lot of his teachings, that was the underlying reading. When the reading came through and he gave that message to people, I have to tell you that Edgar Cayce's readings are not easy to understand. I also was looking at a program called A Course in Miracles. A Course in Miracles will also go into this principle. So this is an underlying spiritual principle. It's also one of the universal laws, law of oneness. So this principle shows up for us in so many ways, in so many different directions from so many spiritual teachers. I didn't have a chance to go look it up in the Bible. But I think you'll find that in there. And if I know you'll find that, I know you'll find that in there. Start looking for the fact that we're all one within your Christian Bible too. And you're going to find that even Jesus talked about that, Master Yeshua, who I call Master Yeshua. So our first spiritual principle is the principle that we are all one, that we are all part of God, and that we cannot be separated from God. So that concludes today's program. We're trying to keep these about 30 to 45 minutes in length. And again, hopefully tomorrow Facebook will work for us and we'll have this live on Facebook. Does anybody have any questions? No. Okay, very good. Well, then I will see you tomorrow at 4:30, and if I'm going to get on Facebook sooner, and hopefully it works. And if it doesn't, we'll just do Zoom throughout the week, and we'll just post them this way. Please feel free. You're welcome. Please feel free to write comments in the post that I post this in, and have a very blessed day. Talk to you later. Bye now.